Just as a reminder, Sharks for Kids is an educational platform geared for shark education and conservation internationally. Sharks for Kids has a wide diversity of educational tools and materials available on our website, sharksforkids.com. This is teacher curriculum packets, activities for individuals just going onto the website. We have recorded webinars just like this one that we're recording right now. And we also present internationally, both virtually and in person when possible, to classrooms or group organizations. We discuss about shark ecology, biology, conservation, and our own research. Today, we're going to listen to Dr. Gonzalo Araujo, who's going to teach us about whale sharks. He is a marine scientist and conservationist. He actually began his career working on molecular biology to reduce dependency on fish resources. And throughout his career, he has now just last year founded his own Marine Research and Conservation Foundation, which is a UK-based charity that works through global partnerships to tackle marine conservation issues, including projects on blue sharks, eagle rays, and whale sharks. I'm so excited you're here. I'm so excited to learn about the largest fish. For those live audience members with us right now, please use the Q&A chat box to ask questions during and after Gonzo's talk. So with that, I'm gonna go ahead and let you have the floor, so to speak.
Thank you, Annie. Thank you so much for that introduction. I will now share my screen. 1 second. Sorry, Annie, I'm not allowed to share my screen. I don't know if it says it's disabled by the host. Sorry. Oh, now we go. That should be working. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good evening, depending where you are. My name is Gonzo, and thank you, Annie, for your introduction. As Annie was saying, I've been working with sharks for the past almost 10 years and with whale sharks for almost 9 years. I started my career, studying plants in the lab. And I quickly realized that working outside and in the ocean was much more entertaining and indeed more needed with the plight for our oceans. I'm currently based in the UK, but I have been living in Southeast Asia the past decade until the pandemic hit. And here we are, and I'm going to share to you today about whale sharks, which is my favorite shark species. So let's learn a little bit about whale sharks. So the whale shark is a globally distributed species. That means we find it in all the world's tropical and warm temperate oceans. So in the Atlantic Ocean, for example, we find them very commonly in the Caribbean. And indeed, in the Gulf of Mexico is one of the largest the largest documented aggregation of whale sharks in the world. Some years ago, my friend Rafael de la Parra and some colleagues, they did some aerial surveys just of Isla Mujeres in the Yucatan Peninsula, and they photographed 420 whale sharks on the surface. So that was an incredible sight. But away from there, we find them in the North Atlantic, all the way to the Azores on warm years, and all the way south to San Helena in the South Atlantic, widely distributed through the Indian Ocean, in the West Pacific, and the Eastern Tropical Pacific as well. So what about the whale shark? So the whale shark is the world's largest fish. We don't know exactly how big they can get, but there has been 3 different studies using different methods to estimate what might be the largest size these animals can get to. And we now know that they can grow to 18 to 20 meters. So this is the size of a large double-decker bus. So we're talking about 60 feet long. These things are massive. Most aggregations around the world, however, host juvenile whale sharks. So we're kind of talking 3 to 6 meter whale sharks. And this is one of these sexual and size segregation that we see in many species of sharks and other species of predators as well. I'll get on to that in a little bit. So whale sharks can live over a century. Again, we have a diversity of methods that we can apply to estimate the maximum growth of these animals. So we know they can live at least a century, and that's incredible. This also puts them at a bit of a risk, because we know that they're very slow growing and they mature quite late, 25 to 30 years old. That means if we're capturing and we're fishing whale sharks when they're quite small, they're not going to be able to reach sexual maturity and therefore reproduce and pass young for the next generation. Because of this and because of pressures that I'll get onto in a minute, the species is listed as endangered in the IUCN Red List. And this is because we understand there's been a global population decline of over 60% in the last 3 generations. So in the past 75 years or so, we've removed over 60% of whale sharks in the ocean. Because of this also, they're also listed in appendices 1 and 2 on the Convention on Migratory Species. This is an agreement of many, many countries to try and conserve species that move between different countries, like the whale shark. And they're also listed into CITES Appendix 2, which is a management regulatory system for species under threat. And this means that if you want to harvest whale sharks, you need to prove that what the level of harvest you're doing on a species or a subpopulation is actually sustainable. To date, there has been no such a study on whale sharks. So most countries actually have protected the species and have not allowed the sustainable take of whale sharks, if you will. From what we know, there's about 25 to 30 global hotspots. This is areas where whale sharks aggregate in numbers of over 100 individuals or more. And how do we know how many there are? Well, the spots on the body of the whale shark are actually unique to every animal. So we can use it as a fingerprint. So if we jump in the water and there's like a group of whale sharks around, we can actually look at their spot pattern and recognize one individual from another. They're also very deep divers. The deepest recorded depth for a whale shark is over 1,900 meters, so close to 6,000 feet. And this is likely a lot deeper. It's just the tags some scientists use were actually not able to withstand the amount of pressure at depth. So we think that probably diving in the 2,500 to 3,000 meter kind of region. We've tagged some whale sharks in the Philippines, very small whale sharks, and we have records of over 1,000 meters. So we know that from a young age, these animals are able to penetrate those deeper layers of the ocean, which is super interesting. The whale shark is one of 3 filter feeding species of shark. We have the megamouth shark, that is also a very understudied species that lives in deeper water, and also the basking shark, or the tiburón peregrino in Spanish. These tend to inhabit in cooler temperate regions. So for example, we find them off the east coast of the US and Canada, in the North Atlantic, all the way to British Columbia in the Pacific, off Japan and Russia. And there's also sightings in New Zealand. So we know these guys can travel into those cooler waters, so lower latitudes. So whale sharks form these predictable aggregations. So they're solitary animals, but at certain times of the year, we seem to find them in these coastal areas where they aggregate to feed on predictable prey sources. For example, coral spawning or fish spawning creates a high density of biomass where these sharks can come and capitalize and make the most of that unique feeding opportunity. They're incredibly adapted to food. So we've documented whale sharks feeding on zooplankton, a huge array of tiny organisms that live in the ocean, all the way to like big fishes. And I've actually seen them in Indonesia feeding on small trevally, about 20 centimeters or so. So they are filter feeders, but they can also adapt their behavior to unique and new foraging opportunities. And this has become quite topical because there are certain places in the world where they actually feed whale sharks to drive tourism. This is called provisioning. And it's a very contentious issue where there is a lot of people that agree and a lot of people that disagree with it. And it's not part of this talk today. But we know, because of that, we know that whale sharks can indeed adapt their behavior to unique foraging opportunities. So it actually makes them quite uniquely positioned species to bigger threats like climate change, for example, that is going to drive maybe part of their productivity and feeding opportunities to smaller quantities, so it's going to drive their prey away. But we know whale sharks can adapt to different prey sources. So they might actually be able to fend off better than other species. But this is understudied, so don't quote me on that one. So food in the tropics is patchily distributed. So these animals have evolved to be very good at finding food. When they find food, they make the most of it. And once that food source is depleted or the amount of food becomes too low, that it doesn't make sense for them to spend a lot of energy feeding on this prey, they move to a new area to possibly feed on the same prey source or a different prey source. And as I mentioned earlier, whale sharks tend to segregate by sex and age. So most of the aggregations around the world are between 3 and 6 meters long. And there are a few exceptions in the world, for example, like the Galapagos Islands in the Eastern Tropical Pacific, where 99% of the whale sharks encountered there are adult females. So these are females over 10 meters long, and they look pregnant. But scientists to date have not been able to detect pregnancy in these females. We're hoping that in the near future, we understand a little bit more about their pregnancy, how they get pregnant, where they give birth, and so on. So most aggregations around the world are juvenile whale sharks, more small whale sharks, and most of them are male. For example, a lot of my studies were in the Philippines over the years. This is in Southeast Asia, and most of the whale sharks there are male, like 80 to 95%, depending on the site. So where are the juvenile females? We don't actually know. There is only one place in the world, in the Saudi Arabian Red Sea, where the aggregation of whale sharks there is actually made up of 50% female and 50% male. And the only other example is in St. Helena Island in the South Atlantic, where they're also 50% female and 50% male, but these are adult whale sharks. So we think there's something else going on there that is not just feeding. But we actually know very little about whale shark reproduction in general. Everything we know comes from a single pregnant female ever fished or properly examined. This was in Taiwan in the mid-90s. This was a 10-meter female and was carrying 304 pups in her belly. And the pups were classed into 3 size classes. There were 42, 56, and 64 centimeters. And some genetic analysis the following year showed that actually all these pups came from a single father. So the female was able to fertilize her eggs in stages so that she could probably maximize the survival of those young whale sharks when they were born. And the following decade gave us a little bit more insight. So whale sharks, it looks like they're being born between 46 and 65 centimeters or so. And we found some of these free-swimming whale sharks in the Philippines. And these whale sharks were new of the year or newly born. So we know that they're born at like 60 or so centimeters. This is just under 2 feet. And where do these whale sharks go from 2 feet to 60 feet? It's quite an incredible growth spur. So what we're trying to understand is they're born really, really small. They're really, really vulnerable to predators, but we don't see them. These occurrences of baby whale sharks are super, super rare. So what we suspect is going on is that these pups are hanging out at depth or in the open ocean. That's where we're not looking. Because if we think of coastal areas around the world, this is where we live. This is where most humans are. So this is where we have a lot of eyes on the water. There's a lot of fishing pressure. There is nets. There is people looking out for fish and sharks and so on. So it's very likely that these guys are hanging out where we're not looking. And it's likely the case for juvenile females as well. So by understanding where we're not looking, we get an idea of what we're looking for might actually be that we cannot find. And this leads us to why whale sharks are actually endangered. We still have these key knowledge gaps about their reproduction and where the juvenile females are or the adults are hanging out or where they're giving birth. But what we do know is that there are and there were operational targeted fisheries in Asia until very recently. And some of these fisheries were landing or processing up to 1,000 whale sharks per year. Now, this number is incredible because when you think that places like Ningaloo Reef in Australia, for example, they've been studying whale sharks there for over 20, 30 years, 25 or 30 years, and they've identified about just over 1,000 whale sharks. So the fact that 1,000 whale sharks are being processed in some of these places is actually staggering. And it's part of the reason why we understand that the level of take that was going on was unsustainable. And it still goes on that there is bycatch and there is non-targeted take. For example, these people might not be trying to fish a whale shark, but if the animal is dead on their net, they might feed on it because they like the meat and it's an opportunistic is an opportunity to get food and food security for their families. So there is some of this still going on, not just in Asia. This is global, unfortunately. Another threat to whale sharks is vessel collisions. The first reports came from 1940, actually. A guy called Gudger was compiling all the reports of whale sharks from around the world. And the most common occurrence of whale sharks was on the bow of big ships. When they were coming into port, they had dead whale sharks on the bow. And now we understand this a little bit better. We know that vessel collisions can have individual level fitness implications. For example, there is a source for infection. It can slow their growth rates. But their overall survival, we don't actually understand. There is an ongoing global study right now to try and understand the overlap between whale sharks at the surface and shipping traffic that has increased drastically in the last 3 decades or so. So with more ships, more big ships out on the water, we know that some of these collisions at speed would likely be fatal. The problem is, whale shark body made of cartilage, when they stop swimming, they actually sink to the bottom. So if one of these whale sharks is hit by a big vessel, we wouldn't necessarily find the body like we do with baleen whales, for example, where they float to the surface and we might have it stranded on a coastline. With whale sharks, it's different. These guys sink to the bottom, so we have no way of actually understanding the level of impact from vessel collisions. But we know that the large vessel collisions likely would lead to mortality in this species. Another threat to whale sharks is pollution. There's various levels of pollution. One you will be more aware of is plastic pollution. Because these guys are filter feeders, that filter in the water column, these can block their gill plates. So where they feed from and where they're breathing from. So if this is causing blockages, it is likely driving some level of, is having some sort of physiological impact on these animals. Unfortunately, because again, the bodies sink to the bottom, the records of whale shark deaths due to pollution are very, very low, including in the Gulf of Mexico, where we have the Deepwater Horizon, and where we have one of the largest aggregations of whale sharks in the world. To date, there has been no attributed mortality to whale sharks from the oil spill. So we know this is likely happening. It's just we're not having access to these dead animals to understand the full implications of some of these pollutants. For example, for plastics, if you think how much plastic we have in the ocean, to date, there is only 4 attributed mortalities linked between plastic and whale shark. One in Japan, one in Malaysia, one in Thailand, and one in the Philippines. Interesting that all of this is in Southeast Asia, where we have the biggest output of plastic into the oceans. So something for the next generation to study for sure. So how do we study this highly mobile species that spends most of its time in the water, all this time in the water, but a lot of the time in deeper water or in the open ocean where we don't actually see them? So we can get creative. For example, we can use local ecological knowledge. This is talking to locals, talking to people who are fishing out of the water every day, and they're more likely to see a whale shark, whereas you are on land and maybe you survey 1 day a week or twice a year, you're not going to find that whale shark. But these guys might be seeing them every year. So local ecological knowledge is a really powerful tool. It also links us to coastal communities and gives us access to a lot of the knowledge that they have that we wouldn't traditionally have following conventional scientific approaches. But for whale sharks, because we know their spot patterns on the body are unique to every animal, we can actually harness that potential. So if every whale shark any person in the world sees has access to a unique individual fingerprint of that whale shark, it means if we can put all this information together, we know where whale sharks are hanging out, how they're linking, how they're moving between countries and within countries to different areas. So with whale sharks, what we do is we do this technique called photo ID. So we take a photo of the left side of the body, and that gives us all the information through that fingerprint. And this is really powerful. To date, there is over 13,000 individual whale sharks that have been identified through dedicated research and through citizen scientists, so members of the general public that share their photos of whale shark with scientists, and we can actually put all of this data together. In the Philippines, where I spend most of my time, We've identified over 1,900 whale sharks. So it currently represents about a fifth of the world's identified population of whale sharks. And we documented movements with Taiwan, with Malaysia, and with Indonesia in the region using this fingerprint. So it's a really powerful tool. It's also non-invasive. So we don't have to put a tag on the animal. We don't have to touch him. We can jump in the water, stay a few meters away, and we have all the information we want. So this is a little example for you. These are 4 different whale sharks, and you can see how their spot patterns are all a little different. Some are more characteristic than others, for example, having 2 spots together or having more lines. But luckily, this has been automated with software. So a guy called Groth, who was studying the stars for NASA, developed an algorithm to map the stars. So if you think of the body of the whale shark as the sky, and you think each spot is like a star, we can actually apply the same algorithm to the body of the whale shark, and it gives us this unique mapping of each individual animal. So we can then compare them within a database. So this is how we can cross over multidisciplinary science and bring it all together, for example, to understand and protect the whale shark. To date, as I mentioned earlier, we have over 25,000 global hotspots for whale sharks. This is some of my collaborators from around the world. Luckily, in the whale shark world, we're all really nice and everyone works together. So we all share information and we all know what's going on. And we have over 74,000 sighting reports from all over the world and over 13,000 individual animals. So this is fascinating. And it kind of highlights the potential of using the general public to generate more data and understand our species of interest in more detail. So how do we know this? We use this platform called Wildbook for whale sharks that you can access it at whaleshark.org. And if anyone submits a photo or a video of a whale shark, this data then passes down to individual research groups around the world, like the map you just saw, and we can match it to individual data sets on a local level. So you go in on a tour, or you're lucky on a day out in the Bahamas or in Florida, you might see a whale shark swimming around. Get a photo of that left side, because it will help scientists understand if that whale shark has come from one of their sites or if it's moving somewhere else. So we can use photo ID, like I was saying, to understand movement between countries. So this is from a paper published a few years ago, but it shows how, for example, in the Western Indian Ocean or Eastern Africa, you can see how some of the whale sharks move from South Africa into Mozambique and from Mozambique into Tanzania. Or in Southeast Asia, we have movements from Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, all the way to Western Australia as well. So this is a very powerful tool. And what's also really good about it is that it's cost effective. All it takes is a little GoPro, or not even a GoPro. It takes a cheap camera that can be water resistant to capture all this information. And then in the Philippines, which is my area of study, we can actually map a lot of these whale shark movements between on a more localized scale. And we can see that these sharks are going everywhere. So this is a highly mobile species. And all this information, for example, we fed it to the Convention on Migratory Species in 2017, when they were discussing, should we include these species into Appendix 1? That means more international collaboration to protect the species. And we had all this data to share with them. We were like, well, yes, these whale sharks move transboundary. And we have shown it with photo ID and with satellite tags, which I'll talk to you in a second. So tags are really powerful tools, and they can tell us a lot of information about animals. And they also come in a variety of shapes and sizes. And depending on your research question, each tag can give you a different answer. So I'm going to give you a few examples. This is called a spot tag. It's a satellite tag that every time it's at the surface, it has an on and off switch. So when it detects it's at the surface, because it detects the air, it turns the tag on and it starts transmitting to a group of satellites that are going around the planet. And it tries to calculate where the shark is. So over a long period of time, we get an idea of how this whale shark is moving around. And what we see is something like this. We see that whale sharks move close to coastal areas, but they can also do these long distance excursions into adjacent ocean basins or potentially different countries. For example, in the Gulf of Mexico, this was a study a few years ago. you can see that these whale sharks were moving far and wide between Mexico and the southern US, all the way to Cuba, and one of them actually moved into the central Atlantic. So these sharks are moving far and wide, and we need to understand that if we're able to protect them properly. So this was with these type of tags. They're called Popup archival tags. So these tags have multiple sensors and they collect data. And after a determined amount of time, they detach from the body, float to the surface, and start transmitting all that data through satellites. So these tags are fantastic. They're just really expensive. So when it comes to shark research, as Annie knows, you need to balance your research questions with your availability for funds and what you're trying to show. So when it comes to conservation, for example, in this case, it was like a whale shark's moving transboundary, are they moving between countries? So satellite tags were a really good tool to help us show that. For example, this was a study also with these pop-up tags in Baja California, and Denny Ramirez and her colleagues, they were trying to show if juvenile males were hanging close to shore and if the adults were spending more time offshore. And her hypothesis was indeed correct. So some of the juveniles were staying in the Gulf of California and then off the coast of Baja, whereas the adults were spending more time and they did this kind of deep ocean water excursions. There's other types of tags. For example, these are tags that record just depth and temperature, and they're the size of a small battery, and they're very cheap. So they can give us a bit of information about where in the water column the whale sharks are hanging out. And this is a study we published last year, and we were trying to understand, for example, if whale sharks were spending time at depth when they were not spending time near shore where we were seeing them. So we can do surveys, we can find them close to shore, where are they spending the rest of their time? And we understood through these tags that they were doing very deep dives following a prolonged period of time at the surface. So we don't know exactly what they're doing, but we get an idea that if they're spending a lot of time in very hot, shallow water, they're doing these deep water, cold water excursions afterwards. So does it have something to do with thermal regulation? Are they trying to cool down after they spend a lot of time in warm waters? Quite likely. And then there's other tags as well that we can use that are called accelerometers, so 3-axial tags. And these guys work like your phone. They have multiple sensors and can record a 3-dimensional movement of the animal. So in this scenario, we were trying to understand if whale sharks in a tourism site would be, if their metabolism or their overall body expenditure was increasing because of the presence of tourists. And what we found was a lot of graphs. So because we have 3 different sensors, we then need to put all of this together to understand it. But essentially, when we thought these sharks were actually not spending any energy at all, they actually were. So these were like quite high energy periods of time the sharks were having during the tourism interactions. So our idea that they were quite relaxed and feeding at the surface was not actually so. So we're in the process of finishing this study now. Hopefully I can share with you more in the near future. And then another way we have to study some of these oceanic animals is by looking at their DNA, for example. So by looking at their DNA, we can understand if the whale sharks from one part of the ocean to another are actually related, or if they're spending time together or they're mating together, for example. So some preliminary results from our colleague Alex Watts shows that, for example, the whale sharks in the Atlantic Ocean are actually all connected, but they're not connected to the subpopulations in the Indian Ocean or the Pacific Ocean. So this, again, gives us an idea of where whale sharks movements are happening, and if we need to manage them in smaller units, this gives us a bit more information on how to do that. And one new technique that is now coming on board is called microbiome sequencing. So whale sharks have something like 100,000 species of microbes living on the surface of their bodies, on the skin. So we were trying to capture some of the DNA of all these species to see if it gives us a bit of information on the health of the whale sharks. And this is still new technology, so we're still trying to understand what the results mean. But for example, for whale sharks that we're seeing every day at the surface, the family or the amount of DNA from species that are specialized at photosynthesis, so capturing energy from the sun, was much higher than sharks that we were not seeing regularly at the surface. This gives us a bit of information on, okay, so whale sharks at the surface actually create a small microhabitat for microbes that benefits those animals, either using or not using sunlight for energy. So it's really, really interesting, but it's still the early stages of this kind of technology. Another thing we can do is we can look at what they're actually feeding on. So by doing plankton tows near or where whale sharks are feeding, for example, we know that they are present certain times of the year. This is what the graphs look like after spending many hours on the water with a little net. But then we understand, like, okay, so whale sharks are coming out near the surface, near the full moon, certain times of the year. So this can be another piece of the puzzle of how we understand whale sharks and how we can manage them. And then tourism is a huge potential for whale sharks. We know there's over 25 global hotspots for whale sharks where you can swim, participate in educational experiences, but there's also some other examples that are a bit more impactful on the animals. So when does this impact become bad? Does it become bad when it affects their feeding potential, or say they're aggregating in a specific site to mate? Do they want to be disturbed by tourists? So this is something that has to be part of the management plan when we're trying to understand and manage the whale shark. In some sites it's a bit easier, it's very well managed, so they try and minimize the impacts as much as possible. And we have other examples where the impacts are quite high, and the impacts on the physiology and maybe the fitness of individual animals might be very high. So we need to take this into consideration when we're managing an endangered species. We can also use drones to monitor tourism, for example. We can see if the whale sharks respond good or bad, or change direction, or go, or they dive down in the presence of boats or the presence of tourists. So these are all part of our understanding of how the species behaves, what affects them, and how we can manage to reduce that as well. And then ideally, you work with coastal communities and you work with the tourism industry to have sustainable guidelines. These are some guidelines we worked with in the Philippines some years ago. And we came up after some years of studies and showing and collaborating with the tourism industry. We showed them like certain things were impacting the animals. For example, they were changing direction or they were diving down. So we planned to minimize for those. And we also instituted some global standards, for example, keeping a minimum distance or not using flash, because we don't know how sensitive their eyes are, but we know they spend a lot of time at depth. So they might be actually very sensitive. So this is some of the work that we can bring together. And hopefully what we have is a well-managed, sustainable, and globally increasing population of whale sharks in the future. Thank you very much, guys. And I would love to answer some questions. Thank you, Annie.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Gonzo. I learned so much. I've always loved whale sharks, but I've never been able to take the time to learn more details about them, more about their ecology and biology. So yeah, kind of like Gonzo just said, we'll take questions now. You can put them in the Q&A box right at the bottom there. And while some of those pop up, I have some questions about your talk. And can I assume that the whale shark is your favorite shark?
Well, actually,
or do you have another favorite?
My favorite shark is the blue shark, actually.
The blue shark, and what is that? And why is that?
Because it's the most fish species of shark globally. Estimates of around 10 to 20 million individual sharks per year. So there's a bit of a sentimental attachment there. And they're also one of the most successful shark species. So they're very broadly distributed. Is one population globally, one meta population, and they're beautiful. They're very, very pretty. Ooh.
They're very beautiful. I did not realize that they were the most targeted. I did not realize that.
Sorry, I forgot I have one more slide on the elasmobranch of the month, but I can wait after the whale shark questions, maybe?
No, let's go for it. Let me hear it.
Okay. So elasmobranch of the month for you guys is the ornate eagle ray, which is a super, super rare species of ray. It's one of the most cryptic ones and one of the most beautiful ones. I think if you talk to any diver or snorkeler around the world, they would love to see one of these guys. So last year we did what we call a desktop study. So we didn't do any field work. We were trying to understand how many eagle rays, how many ornate eagle rays are seen out there. So we did a little data mining on social media platforms. So we looked for any encounters that people had had with the species. And what we understood was that after very exhaustive searches on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook, on Flickr, which is probably a bit old for many of you guys, but it used to be a popular photo sharing platform online. We found that there was only just over 50 records worldwide from the last kind of 20 years or so, which was fascinating. For us, it was really interesting to understand. This is the largest species of eagle ray. They get to over 3-meter disc width, so wing.
Oh, wow.
And I had the pleasure of seeing one. 3 or 4 years ago, I was on an expedition to understand some sharks in a remote group of islands in the Philippines. And I was diving at about 30 meters, so I was quite deep. And I look up to my right, and along the edge of the reef at about 12 meters or so, I see this massive ray. And to me, it looked the size of a manta ray. It was really big. But it looked obviously like an eagle ray. So I was like, what the heck is this? I've never seen an eagle ray this size. It was humongous. So we slowly shallowed up, and the ray was quite relaxed along the edge of the reef. And it was indeed an ornate eagle ray. So now we have a bit of a global database going, because we can identify individual, like with the whale sharks, we can use their spot pattern on the backs to identify them. And I think we have around 55 or so individuals from around the world with hotspots in the Maldives and Palau. So if you're really desperate to see one of these guys, I would head to one of those two sites. Another cool site for them is Lady Elliot Island on the Great Barrier Reef in Eastern Australia. And they seem to appear there in January and February, but we still know nothing about them. We know they're benthic feeders, so they feed on the bottom, likely on crustaceans and mollusks based on their mouth structure, but we know very little about them. We have a fundraiser going live next year to put some tags on these animals in Lady Elliot Island, and hopefully in the Maldives as well. So stay tuned for that, because that'd be really cool.
It's so cool. I did not realize they get so big. It's it's a little misleading with the individual photos of them, so you don't have a reference. I've never seen one. I've seen spotted eagle rays a ton, but not the ornate. Just a little recap. I mean, even though these whale sharks are so big, they're pretty cryptic, and it shows in how many tools and different methods you use to study them. I mean, it's also so they're not stressed out, and you're trying to be the most non-invasive when studying them. So like not touching them, not handling them as much. But I mean, wow, you really went through the gamut of the drones. There's 6 different types of tags you can use for them. The stars, using the algorithm for the stars on their images. Now, I'm curious, if I were to ever be able to swim with a whale shark, how good of a photo do I need to put into Wildbook? I have the left side. I noticed that square was next to its pectoral or its side fin, and kind of maybe getting a little bit of the dorsal fin. Like, how good of a picture do I need to get for it to work?
Annie, that is a really, really good question. Thank you for it. So ideally, what we want to get is the left side of the whale shark and be parallel to the animal. So most whale sharks tend to swim a little bit underneath the surface. So it might require you to dive down maybe like a meter or so. So be parallel to the left side of the animal and get a photo from the gill slits all the way to the dorsal fin.
Gotcha.
That's the perfect ID shot.
And if it's murky, it might be okay, or
yeah, it's we can use some photo editing tools to improve the image quality. Most places visibility is quite good, especially in the Gulf of Mexico.
Well, I just think that is really very unique how they adapted looking at stars to looking at whales. That is pretty unique. And that was gonna be my question: is a machine do it, or does everybody do you have to stare at these dots all day long?
So the technology is evolving quite quickly. When I started, we used to design. So, for example, any of these photos here, we would assign where the spots are. and then the computer would automatically calculate triangles between the spots.
Gotcha.
And then nowadays we're using machine learning, so the system can actually mine through public images, for example, and source photos that are useful for photo ID. And in the near future, we're going to be using the whole body of the shark. So if you see a whale shark, just keep taking lots of photos.
Just take photos. Just take photos. Okay, so some of these questions we might not have the answers to, and you mentioned that before, that we're still, very much learning, but just curious. Okay, so a whale shark takes 25 to 30 years of age to be mature. So what is a guess on how old a whale shark will live, if that's how long it takes them to mature?
That's a very good question. So because we know they grow very slowly and they mature late, is one of those indicators that we use to calculate maximum age. Based on that, we know they live over a century.
Wow.
Using those methods, right?
Yeah. And yeah, some of these are going to be some timeline questions, but you said that in that one recording that we were able to see of all the pups, it was 304 pups, 42 to 60 centimeters long. I can't even make the range in the screen here. How long do you think the females are pregnant for if they're creating that many pups?
That's a very good question. We don't actually know. So the team in Galapagos, they've been doing some ultrasounds of the large females there. These are like 12, 14, 16 meter whale sharks. So very, very big females. And the team conducted various ultrasounds there. But so far, no indication of pregnancy, but there is indication of development. So the females there are definitely adults and they are producing eggs. Gotcha. So what the team is missing is the right timing to get them pregnant on the ultrasound. So gotcha. It's likely, given the size and the fact that these guys grow rather big, I think pregnancy period would probably be under a year. Gestation period would probably be under a year for an individual pup. So if they're giving birth in batches, it's probably the first batch takes 6 to 9 months, and then another group is also born afterwards. Huh?
Cool. I get a lot of questions during my presentations about sharks and the dinosaur timeline of when they were put onto this earth. So we have 3 types of filter feeding sharks, where all else are carnivorous of some sort, either nurse shark over here eating a shell, or bull shark eating fish over here. Are they younger or older shark species compared to these carnivorous sharks? Does that make sense?
It's a good question, yeah. I'm not going to lie, top of my head, I can't remember, but I think it's somewhere along the 60 million year line.
So young, much younger, I believe. Yeah. So they had these more voracious, if you will. I mean, filter feeding can be voracious if you're the krill, but so this was an adaptation of going to smaller animals at a younger time than maybe their predecessors.
I guess it's one of these, because the filter feeding species are the largest, so the basking shark, the whale shark are the largest sharks. I guess the strategy there was like grow slower, feed on small stuff for longer. And it's an equal life history strategy to like baleen whales or like, elephants or dinosaurs actually. So it's these guys that grow slowly but go for the long run.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Super interesting.
Great. No, I had to ask this. I just get asked this question so often, and I study living sharks and living predators, and so yeah, I never get the time to have the conversation about it. But well, thank you so much. I don't want to keep you for too long. Those were just really, I learned quite a bit. I really enjoyed it, and thank you for answering all the questions.
Thank you, Annie. It's been a pleasure, and looking forward to chatting more soon.
Yeah, definitely. And everyone there, I hope you all enjoyed our webinar. And there are many more on our channel, our YouTube channel of Sharks for Kids, where you can see our webinars that we have been recording for over a year now. So yes, we have some of our guests saying, thank you so much, Gonzo. And I'm going to go ahead and stop recording. Everyone have a jawsome day.